Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Mess. So, Dick and I'm going to be doing a video today talking about the Steam Machine performance when it comes to emulation. That is because of my initial Steam Machine review. Basically, everyone wanted to see how RPCS3 for PlayStation 3 emulation was doing on Steam Machine. That's exactly what we're going to be taking a look at today, because decent amounts of PlayStation 3 games will emulate super well on the Steam Deck. And I did a Steam Deck tutorial for PlayStation 3 emulation some years ago, but now that we have Steam OS, we have EmuDeck, and we have a lot more power on tap, we're going to see exactly what we're getting as far as frame rates and performance are concerned out of Steam Machine. Some of the games in this list are going to be things you recommended. Some of them are going to be ones I picked just because I wanted to see how they worked and felt like it would be a good example. And if you do see any sort of hitching, take a look at the bottom left hand side of the screen. This is the performance when you first run the games when you're actually doing shader compilation. And I like to baseline things without any patches and without pre-compiling the shaders. That way you know what you see here is the bare minimum performance you will get on a Steam Machine if you do the same thing. But trust me, once you play a little bit, it'll even get better. But so far, I am hyper impressed, and I should be for the cost and the hardware inside of this thing, that this is just absolutely an emulation beast, and basically every best emulator for every console out there is going to run super well on the Steam Machine. So if you want to see more of these videos, leave me a comment down below and tell me what console you want to see next, both as a setup guide as well as a performance test, that way we can kind of benchmark everything going on. Let's go into the first game now that you've seen the Steam Machine again, and we'll talk about the overall performance. And you will see I left the frame counter at the top left hand side of the screen. I think it's ugly as sin, but I know you guys want to see it and it wouldn't make sense otherwise. And I totally understand Virtua Fighter 5 is not the type of game that is going to push RPCS3 for all it's worth. But this is my first test because it is very important. One, I played the ever-loving hell out of this game and I know how it should feel. And two, when it comes to frame pacing, which I didn't put a graph on the screen because that was huge and drove me nuts, this is something if you're having any sort of weird frame pacing or any sort of latency in the input, it would not be a good time whatsoever. And getting into the first match here again, some games aren't as sensitive to the frame timing or to the input as others, but something like a fighting game like Virtua Fighter 5 was 100% dependent on that being a smooth experience. And I'm here to tell you, at least in my first test, one that no one asked for, but the one that I started with first, this felt absolutely flawless. I used my TR Octopus Flight Stick on the actual Steam Deck, an amazing arcade stick if you need one, and it absolutely just felt every bit as natural as emulating this thing on my editing PC right next to the Steam Machine. It was flawless. I had no issues, no graphical glitches, no weird frame timing whatsoever, and absolutely no input latency in the controls. It would be instantaneously easy to tell if something like that wasn't working, and at least in my experience here, and this is again the first time I ran the game, didn't let anything cache beforehand, I had no issues whatsoever, and that was definitely a win. Now again, it's a win I expected because the Steam Machine has a good spec for something like PlayStation 3 emulation. And if you need that RPCS3 guide or RPCS3 tutorial for Steam Machine or Steam Deck, I just uploaded one recently and I will leave a link in the description down below because it really isn't all that hard to get running. And I would say something like PlayStation 3 along with Shad PS4 and Xbox 360 emulation are going to be quote-unquote the hard mode for something like Steam Machine. Not to say they don't have the power to do it, but they're some of the more resource-intensive emulators out there, so it's where you basically see issues. And just take a look at the motion cadence to the frames here. That's why I don't put the frame timer up all that often, because I want you to pay attention to how the game looks and feels to your eyes and not stare at a graph and mix the actual content up. Everything here is fast, it's fluid, all the frames are animating as they should, all of the pacing is correct, and all the fluidity in a game where fluidity 100% makes or breaks the experience is here, and that is absolutely outstanding. And just so you know, I have dialed the internal running resolution of these games up to actually push beyond what they would have done on real PlayStation 3 hardware, and was still able to maintain the exact frame rate I would expect, at least out of Virtua Fighter 5. And it's not like there's bad news coming. I'm just going to talk about that game to game dependent. That way you know exactly what we're looking at for every single experience. But as far as Virtua Fighter 5 and RPCS3 emulation on Steam Machine, 10 out of 10, no issues. Also going to be our first soundtrack sample so you can hear the audio quality. And I'll be right back.
Fight one! Ready? Go!
So it looks like Virtual Fighter, it sounds like Virtual Fighter, and apparently I got the USB switch in the actual audio there because I do use one keyboard and mouse to go back between Steam Machine and my editing PC and was turning the capture off. But moving over to God of War, this is a game that wants to target 60 frames per second in engine, but will often dip, and seeing it dip in emulation is not surprising whatsoever because it's basically doing the exact same thing as RPCS3 is trying to be a PlayStation 3. And while yes, you can change settings to get a higher frame rate, again, I am baselining this as an out-of-the-box experience. And again, on Steam Machine, this is 100% infinitely playable and really is running exactly the same as my editing rig. Now, like I said, you can definitely apply patches, get different things out there to get these games running even better, but that wouldn't be the out-of-the-box experience with the game files and RPCS3. And when I want to do these tests to try to see the overall baseline specification, I don't want to put anything on the games, patch or otherwise, that would affect the outcome. If something crashed that didn't crash before, how would I know if I blamed it on RPCS3 emulation or the patch in and of itself? So I try to keep these things very consistent again so that whatever you see on my screen, I 100% know you can replicate and even make better on yours when you decide to play around with it. But God of War 3 is one of those games still absolutely looks fantastic and emulates extremely well in RPCS3, and on Steam Machine it's definitely keeping up, which is something you can't really say exactly the same about the Steam Deck because the performance on RPCS3 can definitely be hit or miss depending on what game you're playing. And again, the shader caching is always going to cause hitching when you're actually first playing a game. That's just something that you deal with when you deal with this emulator. You can get different shader cache compilations out there to apply them before you actually run the games. That's not something I usually do for these tests, but I know a lot of time people talk about why does it have to cache those shaders, and basically it's translating the calls from what hardware would be in a PlayStation 3 for video to what hardware would be in a Steam Machine or any other gaming PC for the video. It is just something about emulation of this generation that always has to get dealt with, but once you get through that shader cache once, it's never going to appear again so long as you don't delete your cache files. And they aren't the biggest things in the world, so honestly, just leave them as is and there won't be any issue. But just like Virtual Fighter 5, it was fast, it was fluid and responsive, and was doing everything I would expect God of War 3 to do. And like I said, this generation and even now in modern gaming with PlayStation 5, you end up in situations where games try to lock to 60 frames per second, but just can't quite maintain that. But let's move over to a game that has a 30 frame per second lock and one that's going to hit the overall CPU functionality of a PlayStation 3 a little bit harder due to all the physics and all the different items on screen, because sometimes it really isn't the overall graphics that are going to cause any potential bottleneck. It can just be a CPU workload. So Katamari Forever, one of my favorite Katamari games and favorite PlayStation 3 games, we're going to check and see if that can maintain its 30 frame per second target. And I totally get it, it's not the most intensive PlayStation 3 game out there, but it is an excellent test because this, again, will dip down on frames on standard PlayStation 3 hardware when there's a lot of stuff going on screen at once. But if you take a look at that frame counter, you're basically hovering between 29.99 and 30.01, and that really isn't any sort of measurable difference. It's just kind of how the frame counter works. Everything in Katamari Forever was exactly how I'd expect it to, and again, I have dialed up the internal render resolution of these games within RPCS3, and I expected if any game was actually going to give us a little bit of hell, it might be Katamari Forever, just because of how many things it is computing at once in real time. But the Steam Machine absolutely chewed through this one, and it is our next soundtrack sample because I'm not letting you leave without Katamari music. So go ahead and listen, I'll be right back with even more tests. I mean, you honestly can't go wrong with a Katamari soundtrack, and Forever has one of the best soundtracks and honestly, just some of the best vibes going on. And like I said, there's different things that can actually bottleneck emulation or even hardware. Sometimes it's a lot of physics calculation, sometimes it's just a lot of items on screen at once that need to be managed, sometimes it's a bunch of graphical effects that really push the GPU portion of what a PlayStation 3 is, either on real hardware and emulation, and sometimes it is all of those in conjunction. But Katamari just has a lot of things going on, a lot of objects to render in, a lot of of different math to calculate, and this is something you can see from that frame timer again was rock solid consistent at 30 frames per second, and that's what I want to see out of a game like this. And it is a situation where if you're even losing a few frames, it's going to be noticeable in the capture, it's going to be noticeable in the gameplay, and I had absolutely no issues here whatsoever. And if for some reason you've never played Katamari Forever, I can't stress out enough, this is one of my favorite entries in the franchise. It's such a charming game and series that if you have anywhere to start and you want to emulate some PlayStation 3 on Steam Machine or Steam Deck, it is a very fun candidate to take a look at. Now, of course, we had to have a Souls game in here because it's one of those things. They are very popular, and emulating them can actually get you a higher quality as far as the running resolution is concerned than something you would see on real hardware. And sure, some of these games have been remastered or re-released here and there, but this really is a performance check and not so much talking about what the quote-unquote best version of a game would play is. And obviously on FMV video sequences here, you're going to get 30 frames per second. When we get into the game, we want to see that as well because this is targeting 30 frames per second just like Katamari is. Some games here like Virtua Fighter 5 go for that 60 frame per second counter. Some go for 30, but we want to see a frame rate that is consistently locked at where the game would want to run it as. That way we can say that the performance on the emulation side of Steam Machine is correct. And just like we've seen with Virtua Fighter 5 and just like we've seen with Katamari Forever in a game that wants to lock that frame rate, we're getting basically exactly what we need to, which is 30 frames per second. And again, that can be played around with, but baselining it so I know everything is consistent. It's doing exactly what I would expect. It's also going to be our next soundtrack sample just because it's a very fun soundtrack and I want you to listen to it, and I'll be right back. I mean, Dark Souls music is absolutely a swords and sandals kind of fantasy epic vibe going on, and it sounds exactly the same coming out of RPCS3 as it would out of a PlayStation 3, but honestly, even if the speed suffers, audio quality in RPCS3 usually doesn't have much of an issue. And this thing was locked to 30 frames per second up until the point I died, but that is an area in the game where it can actually struggle in real hardware too, and again, with different enhancements, you can definitely take this well above what you're seeing here. And I totally get some people might want me to show you the exact last ounce of energy and emulation power you can get out of a Steam Machine, but I don't really like that as far as a workflow ethos is concerned, because then you have to be able to do exactly every single thing I did to get that performance, and there's channels out there that will show you how to modify these games to an inch of their life to get that. What I do is show you the worst possible scenario, just putting the game into RPCS3 and hitting play, and just how good that is, and the fact that you can only get better performance from there. Now moving over to a game that everyone wanted to see, and I'm surprised to see that there's a rendering issue in the rearview mirror. I remember that being fixed up, so if you have any thoughts on that, leave me a comment down below. Gran Turismo 6 here, running as well. If you're wondering why I'm slowing down, I looked away for 2 seconds because my wife was calling me, picked up the phone, and then continued to drive while on the phone, so I think I did pretty decently for that, because sometimes my life is very busy, and I end up having to try to do 2 things at once. Now, if I wanted to emulate Gran Turismo 6, I would probably go over to my editing PC, just because I obviously have that, and the Steam Machine is for videos and to talk about mid-tier emulation on Linux for the channel. But on something like my editing rig, I can go 4K, I can go higher frame rates with patches, and make this thing look almost like a PlayStation 5 game. But again, if you had a PC like that, you really wouldn't be that interested in something like a Steam Machine performance review for RPCS3 and PlayStation 3 emulation. And that's why, even though the Steam Machine is still like $200 to $300 more than I think it should have been, for a lot of people out there on potato PCs that are looking for something that can basically emulate everything, the Steam Machine is going to give you a lot of performance, because if it can run these games at the speed I would expect without any enhancements or patches, then you know full well it's going to emulate everything that RPCS3 has to offer. Just remember, PlayStation 3 emulation is not finalized, it's always still improving, and it'll definitely get better in time. And because they just basically dealt with some of the SPU stuff, finding new efficiencies and better performance, something like the Steam Machine definitely being a mid-tier spec is going to benefit from those enhancements on the RPCS3 side of things. And if you need an RPCS3 guide or RPCS3 tutorial for the Steam Machine and relevant for Steam Deck as well, I just recently ran one on the channel. I will leave a link in the description below. But I'm going to keep racing. You go grab those Steam Machine controllers and emulate some PlayStation 3. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.